Hello, so today we are here to discuss the role of the shadow teacher in the classroom with students on the autism spectrum. Typically, a shadow teacher would be a paraprofessional, which means there aren't yet specific required sets of qualification for a shadow teacher. Another term for shadow teacher that is commonly used is teaching assistant. Now, shadow teachers or teaching assistants can accompany a child in a mainstream school, specifically just the one child, or they could be assigned by the school to assist several children in the classroom at a time. There are several misconceptions about what a shadow teacher or teaching assistant is meant to do in the classroom. One of the major misconceptions, unfortunately, is that other members of the classroom team would assume that the child would be then the main responsibility of the shadow teacher or the teaching assistant. Unfortunately, that means that the inclusive classroom environment suddenly becomes exclusive in that there's a barrier between the student with autism and the rest of the classroom team, who are the subject teachers and the classmates. So the misconception that needs to be cleared is that the student is the shadow teacher's responsibility and less so the subject teacher's responsibility. The shadow teacher must remember that the objective here is for her or his absence to no longer be necessary. So the major objective that every shadow teacher or teaching assistant has in mind is how can we get this child or this student to a point where he or she doesn't need me anymore, not to the same extent at least. When we start thinking about it in that way, we realize that the role of the shadow teacher is simply to facilitate the communication between the student and the subject teacher and the classmates. The goal of independence should always be at the forefront of our work with students on the spectrum. We need to get them to a place where they don't require a middleman to intervene between them and the regular mainstream classroom environment. Here we go back to delegating responsibilities. Shadow teacher or teaching assistant must have clear, well-defined responsibilities and job description from the moment that we start working with the student in the school. This helps avoid any miscommunication in the future. Both the shadow teacher, the parent, and the school need to be aware of who's doing what. When that happens, ideally, the communication or the dynamics between those members should look something like this. The child would be in the classroom as well as the teaching assistant from time to time upon need, depending on the student needs as well. However, as the name would suggest, a teaching assistant would only be assisting the child and the subject teacher. As much as possible, the child should be communicating with the subject teacher less so than with the teaching assistant. The main responsibility of task interaction, instructions, explanations should happen with the subject teacher. The teaching assistant would then intervene if the subject teacher found herself or himself to be struggling with communicating a specific concept or idea or task. Only then would the teaching assistant jump in and intervene and then move back out. But the floor needs to always be open between the child and the subject teacher. And so all of this needs to be communicated and needs to be made explicit at the beginning of the journey when a teaching assistant first joins the student in the class. The teaching assistant needs to realize that her role or his role is temporary, and it should be as least invasive as possible. The subject teacher needs to realize that she holds the major responsibility in the classroom and not the teaching assistant. And the parent must be made aware of that as well. Having all of these clarified will make sure that the child or the student knows what the expectations are, who to communicate with, where to put the most effort. Again, here, the realization or being aware that the major responsibility is on the subject teacher or the homeroom teacher, where she or he need to be communicating with the student directly without the intervention of the teaching assistant first. And then if there's a need, the teaching assistant would provide some sort of support on the spot. Now, obviously, every student will be different. Sometimes, depending on the needs of the students, the teaching assistant would be more involved in the work of the student in the mainstream classroom. Sometimes it would be necessary for the teaching assistant or the shadow teacher to reinforce information or repeat instruction or differentiate instruction outside of the classroom, again, depending on the needs of the students. So it's understandable that there isn't one job description for a shadow teacher or a teaching assistant, because we're working with students on the spectrum, which means that every single case is going to be different. No two children with autism will present in exactly the same way. Each of them will have a diverse manifestation of the characteristics of autism, and so this is something that needs to be taken on a case-by-case basis.